Hello, this is John Romano, and I'm recording this lecture, Late Medieval Disasters, from my course on medieval history. Now, I'm putting here this image of the four horsemen of the apocalypse, and there's a good reason for it. Generally, starting from around the mid-14th century through much of the 15th century, most people would say that the medieval period becomes one of rapid transformation. But you shouldn't think change is always for the best. And in fact, it was quite the opposite in this period. Most of the changes ended up being quite harmful. And historians have often taken to talking about the later Middle Ages as a time of disintegration, twilight. One very famous historian spoke about the waning of this civilization, decline of it. Now, this may come as a great surprise to you. I mean, we had said in a previous period, in fact, Europe was flush with all sorts of agricultural bounty. This sort of natural resources had performed so handsomely. But really, even in this time of greatest success, the seeds of destruction were already planted. And now, in this period, what we begin to see is a whole lot more famine and deaths from famine. In some sense, late medieval Europeans were victims of their own success. There were really all at this point, people had managed to bring almost all of the best land under cultivation already. And for that reason, agricultural production simply begins to sputter out. And now no longer can Europeans depend upon this ready flow of surplus crops that then they could go out and trade and help the commercial expansion in the previous period. It was all they could do to manage to keep themselves alive. And really, the reason for this is that in previous generations, Western Europe had simply become absolutely saturated with population. And the reason why people searched around for enough land was that there were so many people now, and they all had to be fed. And some people think, in essence, that for a pre-modern society, that Western Europe had reached a natural limit for demographic growth. And we can see this in the fact that many Western Europeans at this time begin to work marginal land that really was very poor for crops. To give you one example, this is the territory right around Florence in Italy, a territory that is wonderful for planting olive trees. But the soil itself, we think, is thin, it's rocky, and it's not much really good for planting anything else. But during this time period, Europeans felt they had no choice, and in many cases they actually rip up olive trees, which meant that they also didn't have olives, and they tried to plant wheat. The results were predictable. They got almost nothing out of it. And really, part of this problem, part of the reason why this great plenty of the previous generation had grown up was something that had absolutely nothing to do with human beings. I had told you that between the years 1000 and 1300, the Europeans experienced very favorable weather conditions. And right around the year 1300, all of a sudden, a cyclical change in the weather begins to set in. Really, Europe at this point becomes colder again, around a degree colder, and it becomes a damper, wetter place. So conditions that are really are just worse for doing agriculture at exactly a time when Europeans could really ill afford that change. Many people think that some of the absolute worst conditions held between 1315 and 1317. This was a time in which famine and epidemic begins to really raise its ugly head. Heavy rains begin to assail many places in Western Europe, which ends up wiping out even the small crop that people were able to grow. So we had failed harvests. And in fact, what we begin to see, in fact, is people begin to die from starvation. Really, rumors begin to spread that some of the most desperate people at this point have no choice but to turn to cannibalism. What was even worse, of course, was that the population at this point ends up being very weak because of widespread malnutrition. And in fact, these ended up being good conditions for epidemic disease. And as many of you will know, that is exactly what was on the horizon in this period. And this, of course, is the era of the Black Death, which may seem particularly timely now. The Black Death is not primarily a disease of human beings. It actually is primarily a disease of rodents. The animal that has long been associated most with the Black Death are these guys, black rats, although in recent research has begun to stress that, in fact, other rodents are also responsible for spreading this disease as well. This disease can be transmitted to humans by fleas, which normally are parasites on infected rats and other rodents. But then these fleas will often then leap on to human beings. And you can see here, this is actually a revolting image of a flea that in its gut there, you can see that black thing. That is the Black Death stirring within it. Fleas rather, will at times bite human beings. And yes, they were all over the place in the medieval period. People had fleas on them very commonly. They will bite human beings and regurgitate some of these the flea's bacterium into the human being. And the particular bacterium that causes this disease is right here. It's known as Yersinia pestis. Here's another image of it up close. This actually is probably, of all diseases, the greatest killer ever of human beings. And it was responsible not only for the plague we're talking about now, but there also had been a 6th century plague that now increasingly historians think was also caused by Yersinia pestis. We really see at this point that once people get this bacterium, they begin to experience things like high temperature, aching limbs, and their lymph nodes, like here, begin to swell. And the swell is sometimes referred to as buboes, which is why this is sometimes known as the bubonic plague. I know this is revolting, but here is an image of someone who's really beginning to suffer gangrene as the result of their cells dying because of the Black Death. You can see the blackness. This disease is not always fatal. You can actually, as with many bacterial diseases, gain an immunity to it. But we think that under the conditions that most Western Europeans were at the time, weakened by hunger, they really could not find the reserves of energy to fight the disease, and they would succumb to it, and sometimes extremely quickly. There are actually reports of people getting the disease at the beginning of the day, and then before the day was out, that was the end for them. The epidemic will hit Western Europe around 1347. We now know that its roots appear to be in Central Asia, and it actually goes both to the east and to the west. although Western Europeans will probably get this initially through some of the merchants who would go to places like, for instance, Constantinople, and then they would go into Italy. And from there, again, it hits the south first, Mediterranean ports, and slowly begins to make its way up, spreading throughout the rest of Western Europe. And as you can see from this map, it touches virtually all the regions of Western Europe, although there were certain pockets, essentially mountainous regions, that do not end up being hit as hard. And it actually is one of the cruel ironies of history that just as Western Europeans are beginning to discover the rest of the world and get these new commercial contacts, that in fact it is exactly these new contacts that will lead to merchants often bringing back rodents and rats back with them to Western Europe, who will end up causing this great disease. The loss of life in medieval Europe was catastrophic. We think that it is estimated that anywhere between a third and a half of the population will die in a period of around 5 years. And you can see very strange here in Western Europe. You will see all sorts of examples of mass graves, people essentially dumped into graves all at once. The plague will then remain endemic in Europe for centuries after its first occurrence. It will never reach the same levels of mortality, but there will be smaller localized outbreaks after this point. Nevertheless, no one really knew what I've just been talking about in terms of the microbial origins of this disease, and so people were absolutely bewildered when they encountered it. Really, the reactions of people were really quite different. We know that, of course, many people turned to religion, and there were many priests who would often stay with their flocks to care for them. There was quite a high rate of mortality for many priests because they would end up saying the last rites for many dying people, and then often contracting the disease in the process. So yet another cruel irony. Some of the priests who really cared about pastoral duties were the ones who die in larger numbers. Some people, of course, turned to prayer, some of it like in any other period, other people becoming extremely zealous in the practice of their faith. Perhaps the most interesting of these groups is one known as the Flagellants, a group that really would go around whipping both themselves and others in long processions, with the ideal of trying to cleanse their sins so that God would spare people. So, operating under the theory that the Black Death had been caused by God as a punishment for sinful humanity. Some people will run out of the cities, trying to live a life of enjoyment, recognizing that the cities were really centers of death. But altogether, this was a general panic and really just a demoralizing period on the whole. And although some really held on to the belief that it was God who had caused this, others felt this was somehow the work of the devil trying to tempt them away from true faith. Other people felt that it was the work of some of the prejudiced the groups that people were prejudiced against in society. One of the particular groups that ends up sometimes being identified as the cause is the Jewish people in Western Europe. Some people begin to really utter the baseless claim that Jews were responsible for poisoning the wells of medieval Europeans and thus causing the disease. This was absurd, of course, in as much as Christians and Jews often shared the same exact wells, but you can get some idea of this kind of paranoia that really begins to emerge. Unfortunately, this paranoia would often have deadly consequences for some of the Jewish population, some of whom ended up being massacred as the result of these wild theories. We also see, very interesting, especially those who are interested in art history, this is a fascinating period in as much as some of the most gruesome, darkest images of the Middle Ages come really in this time period in which people were obsessed with death. One of the famous ones is the Dance of Death, where, as you can see, many people are holding hands with skeletons, and really, in many cases, very high people in society, with the message that, of course, everyone is subject to this death. In other cases, too, you would see, here's a very good example of this sort of relatively gruesome images of actually on people's tombs, showing, for instance, rotting corpses. And this is probably due to this macabre obsession with death because it was so omnipresent. Now, if you, of course, were one of those who died, there's little left to be said about your earthly career. For those people, though, who survived, we do think, believe it or not, there end up emerging some unprecedented opportunities for the survivors, and that was particularly true for peasants. At least some peasants in medieval Europe and during the flush times before this seem to have accepted that the conditions under which they labored were just the nature of things. And really, as we said, they'd had to give up a good deal of both their crops and their free labor to nobles. At the end of the plague, though, we'll see that peasants recognize that there is a severe shortage of labor in the countryside. And really, at this point now, peasants can demand better deals from nobles, who, I don't need to tell you, resisted this mightily. Did not want anything to change the relationship between nobles and peasants. And governments would actually ended up in Western Europe responding with laws attempting to fix all the sort of labor conditions as they were before the Great Mortality. Really, what we begin to see then is frustration by peasants who end up deciding that there is no hope of resolving these matters through peaceful means, and so they decide that their only opportunity then is violent rebellion. In England, in particular, one of the most famous figures in this is this man pictured here, or who would circulate things like this. The man known as John Ball, who was a preacher who had this radical vision of equality. Oh, good people, things do not go well in England, and they will not go well until everything is held in common and there are no more peasants or lords. Why should we be kept in bondage? We all come from one father and one mother, Adam and Eve. How can they say or prove that they are greater lords than we are, except that they make us work for what they spend? And this kind of preaching was extremely powerful, and in fact, peasants begin to rise. First in England and then in France as well. In France, it is these uprisings are sometimes known as the Jacquerie, after the name Jacques, because so many peasants were named that. It's like a mass of jacks. These start off as fairly aimless, even incoherent outbreaks, and really, in some cases, just little more than mobs that would begin to attack knights. In some cases, murder some of the most oppressive lords, nobles, and their families. And in fact, leading some nobles of both countries to simply abandon their houses and leave them open for looting. But the movement becomes popular very quickly. It spread from village to village. And really, the only thing that ends up stopping these rebellions is when we finally get noble knights begin to actually create a much more sort of organized force against them with again using armor and lances and swords and horses. And altogether, this was really something that the untrained peasants could not possibly resist for all that long. The later movements of peasants, though, end up becoming far more disciplined, and they begin to aim at far more specific reforms. And we really see, in particular, under the man known as Wat Tyler here, um, the leader of this later movement. He brings together many peasants, citizens of different towns, and they together march on the city of London. And they will plunder houses too, and take some things. But he also attempts to negotiate with the King of England, Richard II. And again, it's really amazing to us to hear some of the demands that Wat Tyler and others were making. They wanted, for instance, much more freedom from peasants. They wanted them not to be like slaves, for instance. And really, the king agreed, or at least pretended to agree to these terms. But we think that after this happens, um, the peasants, who really were not a disciplined army force, begin to loot more. Some of them begin to break in to people's houses and get drunk. And really, Wat Tyler, perhaps really feeling that he was winning this war, he begins to make even more radical demands of the king. For instance, that all church property would then be divided among the laity, that all noble lords would be gotten rid of, save for the king. All local affairs would be ruled over by peasants. And eventually, in front of the king here, Richard II, he would suppose Wat Tyler would make these demands in a very rude, aggressive fashion, and one of the king's men responded by killing Tyler. Richard II then would ride out to the rebel army, declare he was their true ruler, and he would lead them outside of the city. They were escorted out and eventually allowed to disperse peacefully to their homes. So not accomplishing anything immediately. With all of that being said, though, we do think that these revolts would have a long-term effect. And really, the fear that these revolts had caused would be enough then to make many Western European kings and other rulers give far better deals willingly to peasants, just so that these kind of rebellions would never happen again. They acknowledged their personal freedom, for instance. The peasants were not slaves tied to the land. They begin to say, for instance, that no longer would peasants have to give so much of their crops or free labor to nobles. They instead would simply accept a certain amount of rent. Really, they would accept cash now. And so all of this meant that ultimately peasants do get better conditions, even if not directly after these revolts. Many people would say, of course, that at this time where Europeans already are struggling with instability, with disease, and at the same time, they're facing this kind of rebellion among peasants, that this would be the absolute worst time to get involved in a long war. But that is exactly what happens, especially in what is known as the 100 Years' War. A series of wars that actually altogether would actually go over 100 years altogether. But this really is not the kind of total war that you might imagine from the modern world. There are many long periods of truce in the midst of this long war. And we also, in medieval fighting, as a general rule of thumb, people would only fight, for instance, during certain times of day and certain times of year. So we're not talking about just nonstop war for over 100 years. With all of this being said, though, many people would say that the violence of medieval society flares out in a savagely destructive fashion during this time period. By the end of the 13th century, although the King of England once had a lot of territory in France, he had, by this point, very little left, and especially this area here in southwestern France still belonged to the King of England. When the French kings themselves had very little power, it was very difficult for French kings to worry too much about the fact that the English had so much French land. As though we think that the French king becomes more and more powerful, this was a thorn in the French king's side. And frankly, it was also exasperating to the English king to really, in some sense, be a vassal also of the French king for that one bit of territory. As ever, too, there were always all sorts of squabbles between the two countries that had occurred before war breaks out. There were questions about, for instance, that the French king supposedly was disrupting the wool trade of the English before this point. The situation, though, finally comes to a head, though, because of a dynastic accident. The King of England, Edward III, had actually become a potential claimant to the French throne. The male Capetian line ends up dying out, and so the French decide that they're going to instead go through the female line and give it to Philip VI. However, Edward III was not going to take this lying down. He had an equally good, if not a better, claim to the throne, and he decides to press his claim. Edward III was a strong-willed and, we think, a firm-handed ruler who had all sorts of able men to conduct his administration, but he had lots of flaws too. He loved luxury, he loved pretty women, and he wanted glory, especially the glory that comes through military victory. He seems to actually have believed some of the ideals of chivalry, like in the stories of King Arthur. Philip VI, the French king at the time, himself, he also loved luxury and pomp. He loved watching tournaments and other knightly sports. And he too felt one could get all sorts of glory as a warrior. In addition, we think that the French king seemed to have no comprehension of the tactics of war. And on top of that, he was a man who was proud, easily offended, and deeply suspicious of virtually everyone around him. Considering all of these negative qualities of the leaders of the two countries, it didn't take all that much to drive these two men to war. We think that to another dispute over this territory, in which that England had in France, the French really appear to have been now moving into that territory. Edward III decided to declare war, and then he decided to take the war to France. Edward's armies were far better organized than the French. The English had the longbow, as shown here, a bow that was 6 feet long, and had a great range, and really had very strong striking power, and could actually go through chainmail, and its speed was great as well. And this is the reason why many of the 14th century campaigns all went to the English. And you can imagine that, especially with the longbow, lower men of low social class, could easily mow down nobles. After these military victories, the French really could not hold back against English armies, and One of the most infamous figures in this is this man here, Edward, the Prince of Wales, known as the Black Prince as the result of his armor. Ends up wandering around France, in essence, looting things, burning areas, and even at one point managing to capture the French king and getting ransom for him. Really, the fortunes of France in this war only turn around with this man here, Charles V, who was a highly intelligent, hard-working king who actually was had a far better idea of politics and tactics than previous French kings. He also was a good judge of talent. We think that part of Charles V's intelligent strategy when he overtakes this war is that he recognizes that the French don't have it in them at that point to beat the English directly on the battlefield. And so he instead insists on small skirmishes meant to wear down the English, because of course the English were in enemy territory, and really we think that whenever he could, we think that he would take advantage of the English. For instance, when they went out of fortresses to attack somewhere else, he would take those fortresses. I would ambush them. Those kind of things. So small warfare. And so little by little, we think the French begin to take back some of the land that was there. Part of the problem, though, is that increasingly is what the French found is that really this was no longer as fun for the English as it had been previously, and many of the English begin to lose interest in the war altogether. And in fact, some of them will even pull out of the war entirely. But the problem is that the mercenaries who previously had been hired by the English will recognize that they are without pay now, and really they often will continue to fight even after they're no longer employed. And mercenaries simply began to live off the land, wandering around, plundering people, doing the same sorts of chaos as an army that's actually being paid. When we move into the 15th century campaigns of the Hundred Years' War, these start again very well for the English. They won the Battle of Agincourt, for instance, which is another complete disaster for the French, for reasons that no one really has entirely figured out. The French line up their battle ranks in a bizarre order. For some reason, their men who had crossbows were put last, which meant that they really couldn't actually shoot arrows at the English. And the French also appear, in spite of the fact that they had actually faced English armies with a longbowman in the past, they end up, the nobles still suit up with enormously heavy armor. And really, when they fall off their horses, they can't get up, in some cases, really just leading to slaughter. And so, really, the English managed to slaughter a good deal of the French in this war, and those they don't, they simply take hostage. And so, for a period of time, again, the English king became the masters of a good portion of France, especially in the north, even if really they never had an opportunity to take all of France. It would have been impossible, virtually, based upon the men they had. At this point, the English decide to move to the south, and they decide to try to take the city of Orleans, and they laid siege to it. And this initially seemed like a lost cause, but this is where one of those fantastic figures from the Middle Ages steps into it. This is when Joan of Arc appears on the scene. And as many of you will know, Joan was a peasant girl who received visions from saints, who told her then to raise this siege of Orleans, and to make sure that the claimant to the French crown was received his coronation at the traditional cathedral in Rouen, up here. This is really, Joan then decides to go and make her case to the French, and you can understand why naturally many people viewed her claims with suspicion. But she really very quickly ends up gaining the confidence of the French soldiers. And perhaps more than anything else, what Joan gave them was morale at a time when the French had just been losing battle after battle. And really, it was because of Joan's presence that the soldiers at Orleans decided to actually leave the city and press battle on the English. And in fact, they begin then, after having won that battle, to eventually drive them out of the middle regions of France entirely. And really, this is, we think, turns the tide. It makes the English begin to move further and further up to the north. And amazingly, then, Joan was able to occupy the city of Rouen in northern France and have the French king anointed appropriately. On a later campaign, however, Joan ends up being captured, and she is tried for the witchcraft for witchcraft by the Inquisition. Part of the accusations against Joan was, of course, that these visions were not necessarily from God, that perhaps these visions were instead demonic in nature. And Joan, at some point, appears really under tremendous stress to renounce the visions, but then she decides eventually she will once again embrace them. And at that point, she was found guilty and burnt at the stake. And the French King Charles does nothing to save her, perhaps because he felt that there was really little more service that she could render him. And it was dangerous, of course, to have a saint in the flesh walking around. In spite of Joan's death, however, most people tend to think that the tide had turned in this war. And really, in the 1430s and the 1440s, the French armies would systematically recover all the land lost to the English. And Charles then would eventually stamp out any claims of the English king. The English would surrender, and really, the English would also lose their hold on their territory in southwestern France. All right, we've gone through a lot of negative points of the later Middle Ages. Are there any positive lights at the end of the Middle Ages? And the answer to this question is yes. And for that, we have to look to the movement known as the Italian Renaissance, which really it manages to hold on and really be furthered, even when you think about the backdrop of all these other problems that were occurring. The term Renaissance that we use in English is actually a strange term. It's actually a term from French that means rebirth. And it refers especially between the 14th and, say, the mid-16th century of these intellectual, artistic, and cultural achievements, especially in Italy. It is fair to say that while one could just spend a lot of time talking about the individual things that were produced in the Renaissance, to understand it fully, you have to understand something about the political backdrop of Italy at the time. And that is to say, there was no Italy, not the unified nation that we know of today. Instead, what you see is a series of small individual city-states, all of which had their own little governments. Really, all of these different governments were run on their own, and all of them, frankly, were in competition with one another. They all wanted to be the best, and one of the ways in which this contest between all of them manifested itself was through culture. They all wanted the best artists and the best intellectuals working in their regions. Because because of the area that Italy was, we had said that it had long served as a kind of gateway between Western Europe and areas further to the east, and we do think that it had all kinds of vibrant urban areas. And so when commerce had revived in medieval Europe, really it was Italian merchants that were at the forefront. Organizing businesses, figuring out how to do bookkeeping, figuring out how to find new markets, and securing monopolies for themselves. And so we think that many of these city states become extremely rich. So they have spending money as a result of trade in which to further the kind of competitions between different areas. Um, Again, and none of this, to be able to erect great symbols like, again, the Duomo here in Florence. All kinds of these different city-states begin to grow up, and often were involved in war with one another, which tended to weaken one another. And in time, we think that many merchant oligarchies begin to grab control of many of these cities simply to be able to keep enough security so that the money can be continue to roll in. And we really see in many cases, you get this very interesting sort of mixture between traditional landed nobility and people who had made their money through merchant dealings. And we really see in some cases merchants were willing to accept really very despotic forms of government as long as the people at the top could keep law and order. But really, again, there was a lot of political turbulence and warfare in the meantime, both internal to cities and then between the different city states. Yet, again, what is amazing in a certain sense was that it didn't matter really, in some sense, who was in charge of these different city states. No matter how despotic or in some cases republican these different governments were, or the Pope, everyone was beginning to invest in the art world. And these works of art were meant now to be a really embodiment of the kind of pride that many people felt in their city states. And again, they had the money now to be able to patronize artists. One, for instance, is Sandro Botticelli. This is the Birth of Venus, which in part is meant to represent this kind of rebirth of culture, and specifically one that was often tied to the ancient world. Here's some more Botticelli, of which I can go into detail, but it's fair to say they often draw upon themes of classical antiquity. There is also a scholarly aspect to this Italian Renaissance, and that in fact many people, many scholars this time begin to turn very seriously to works of Latin and Greek antiquity, to read the ancient church fathers, and really very often to go back directly to the source, to the original languages, whether it be Latin or Greek, in which they were written. This was in part because they, first of all, wished to enjoy the beauty of these texts, but it was also because there was a hope that this would allow them to revive the kind of norms and values that they saw in the ancient world. Like, for instance, pride for one's city was something that they felt that these texts had a lot of. And they begin to create this program in which people would study things like very carefully the grammar in texts, how to speak well, history, politics, moral philosophy. All of these subjects become really very broadly studied and debated among people of the upper class. And many of them in particular celebrate the dignity of humanity. And they really prepare people for a life of virtuous action in the world. And so, in essence, it was never thought that one learned these subjects just for the subject's sake, but instead, when they weren't studying them, these same people who were very learned end up being employed by many of these city-states to serve, for instance, as secretaries, speechwriters, diplomats, to make sure that these conflicts did not always spill out into war. So again, there really was a program of action in the world. It wasn't meant to be just studying for its own sake. So in some ways, then, the Renaissance, although it really is taking place, many of these many problems or disasters at the end of the later Middle Ages, in some ways too, they give certainly a sign of hope for the future that that Italy, like the rest of Western Europe, would emerge strengthened from this period of challenge. All right, thank you for your attention. Bye bye.